We'll go ahead and get started. As everybody knows, we're going to be talking about Moyamoya genetics this morning. I think a lot of us have looked very forward to this for quite a while. So I'm not going to waste any time. Dr. Dianna Milewicz from University of Texas at Houston Science Center, something like that. All right, everybody, please give a round of applause.
So I'm from the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you this morning. I'm the President George Bush Chair of Cardiovascular Medicine, but that's George Bush Senior in case anybody here has political leanings against George Bush Jr. And I direct the Division of Medical Genetics, and I got very interested in Moyamoya disease about 4 to 5 years ago, and actually came to the Moyamoya conference in San Antonio to start recruiting patients with Moyamoya disease to try to identify the genes that cause this disease. And I'll go through why, during my talk, why I became interested in Moyamoya disease. I am trained in cardiology and genetics and very interested in the genes that cause problems with the arteries or vascular diseases. And so many years I've been working on aortic aneurysms and aortic dissections, and we sort of stumbled across a gene that caused Moyamoya disease, and I got very interested in this, and nobody was working on it, and I think it's a very important disease or condition that will tell us a lot about arterial diseases, and I'll go through why I think that is. I have made this talk very simple, so hopefully you can follow along and understand what I'm talking about. If you don't understand, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions, and I'll repeat the questions for the people that are watching on the internet. And so if the questions become too many, then I'll ask for fewer questions. But right now, I'm happy to answer questions to clarify things so that you understand what is going on. Okay? So to start out with, just to go through what Moyamoya disease is, it's a condition that was actually named by the Japanese back in the 1950s. And in Japan, there's much higher rates of Moyamoya disease. And we're just beginning to understand why that is, and I'll talk about that during my talk. And so they described it first, and it's, as you know, it's occlusion of the distal internal carotid arteries. The carotid arteries come up our neck and provide blood, oxygen, nutrients to the brain. And so patients with Moyamoya disease have occlusion of both arteries, and because the occlusion occurs over time, they have other arteries that grow called collateral arteries. And when you look at those arteries on an angiogram, they look like a puff of smoke. And Moyamoya means puff of smoke in Japanese. So that's how it got its name. Really unusual name, and it's a Japanese-derived name, but that's what it means, is puff of smoke, because when the dye goes through those small little arteries, it actually looks like a little puff of smoke, and I'll show you a picture. It occurs, as you know, in children and also people up to the age of about 50 years of age. And in about 10% of people with Moyamoya disease, there's other family members that are affected, okay? So this is just an angiogram of a patient with Moyamoya disease. And if you look over here, this is the carotid artery coming up. And then here at the here it suddenly gets much more narrow. And that's the distal part where it's typically affected in patients with Moyamoya disease. And then this is that puff of smoke, the collaterals or additional arteries that form because it's occluded here that provide nutrients to the brain. Okay, so so we wanted to. So there's not much known why the artery is just fine, but then suddenly gets occluded right here. And we want to use the genes that we identified to start to understand why that artery is occluded.
Is the one on the right Moyamoya, the one on the left isn't?
No, this is also Moyamoya and actually shows the puff of smoke. It's just not as occluded as the other side. Does somebody have a radio on or something?
We've gone to check with the hotel. It's coming through the ceiling. Yeah,
they're
working on it.
Good. Okay. So the arteries, so something goes wrong with this artery as it goes up into the brain, that it ends up getting slowly occluded over time, because the fact that we have these new blood vessels or collaterals forming tells us that this occlusion has to occur slowly over time. And so just to go to the next slide. So if you look, I'm just going to go through a cartoon of how these arteries are made. And so your arteries in your body have 3 layers to them. There's a very thin layer here called the intima that is just made up of 1 cell. And then there's a thicker layer called the media, and this is made up of cells called smooth muscle cells. And then there's an outer layer called the adventitia. And it's really these long, thin cells here called the smooth muscle cells that are affected in Moyamoya disease. And I'll talk more about that. And these are muscle cells. They actually have filaments that go across them that allow them to contract, just like our muscles contract and our heart muscles contract to push blood through the body. These smooth muscle cells actually function to contract as blood goes through your arteries. They contract down to regulate pulse pressure and blood flow through the arteries. So normally the lumen here, the inside of the artery, should be totally open and free of cells. But in patients with Moyamoya disease, next slide, there's actually, the artery becomes filled with cells when it's not supposed to. So typically, here is the wall of the artery. This is that outer layer. This is the medial layer, and you see these long, thin cells. Those are the smooth muscle cells. Then this is the inner layer here, the pinkish colored layer here. And then here's the inside of the artery, which is supposed to be completely open. And in patients with Moyamoya, it's filled with cells, and every single one of these dark purple spots is a cell, and that leads to the artery being occluded, and so that blood cannot get through it. So we think the smooth, and these cells, when you look at them and stain them for markers, they actually stain for markers for smooth muscle cells. So we think the cells here in the wall are coming into the inside of the artery and occluding the artery in patients with Moyamoya disease. So that is our hypothesis as a scientist, and so we're trying to test that, and I'll talk more about that at the end of the talk. But so what do we know about what causes this occlusion of arteries? And we know there's a number of risk factors for people to get Moyamoya disease. One is hyperthyroidism. That's where your thyroid is overacting and produces too much thyroid hormone. One is if you get your brain irradiated, sometimes that can cause Moyamoya disease. We know that Moyamoya disease is more common in Asia, and like I said, that's why it was originally described in Japan, because it's much more common there. We know it tends to run in families, so that starts to tell us that maybe genetics plays a role, that people inherit genes, and that from their family members, and I'll go more into this in a minute, that predispose them to having Moyamoya disease. And then finally, we know that there's a large number of genetic syndromes where they're at high increased risk for getting Moyamoya disease. And neurofibromatosis is probably the major syndrome where a significant number of the patients with neurofibromatosis will go on to have Moyamoya disease. And this is actually what the other complication of neurofibromatosis is cancer. And cancer is a condition where the cells grow and proliferate too much, almost like what we're seeing in the arteries of Moyamoya patients.
What is that?
Neurofibromatosis is where we know there's a single gene in the human genome that's altered that causes a pattern in people. And in this case, and so these syndromes get labeled as genetic syndromes because it's due to alteration in genes. And neurofibromatosis is just one of those conditions. It's like cystic fibrosis is a genetic condition, sickle cell anemia, and so on. So these are named syndromes because they affect more than one body system. There's a question in the back? Okay. So there's a number of other syndromes, including one of the types of dwarfisms that cause people to be short. And those patients are also at a high risk for Moyamoya disease. So this tells us, so all these genetic syndromes are due to changes in different pieces of DNA throughout our genome. So right away that starts to tell us that there can be a lot of genes through the genome that can be altered to cause this condition, okay? Predispose people to this condition. And it's interesting that this particular condition also causes cancer, which once again is where cells grow and proliferate too rapidly. Okay, so I'm just going to go through some basic genetic 101 and talk about what we know about genes and so that you understand what I'm talking about, or begin to understand when I'm talking about genes. So, humans get diseases. You know, it can be hypertension, cancer, schizophrenia, alcoholism, but we're all end up getting some disease during our lifetime. And so at one end of the spectrum are genetic causes of disease, and at the other end of the spectrum are diseases that are completely caused by our environment and where we end up being. So trauma is an example of a genetic, of an environmental disease. If you're driving down the freeway and the 18-wheeler next to you suddenly changes into your lane and you have an accident, that's not due to what genes are in your body. That's an environmental cause of a disease. At the other end of the spectrum, there's diseases like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, and so on, where people with cystic fibrosis inherit genes, alterations in their DNA that predisposes them to that disease, and it doesn't matter what environment they're in, they're going to get that disease. They're sort of predetermined based on the changes in their DNA. Okay, but most of the diseases like hypertension, cancer, and infection is actually an interaction between these two factors that predispose to these diseases. And so, and the same with schizophrenia, alcoholism, Alzheimer's. And so we really wanted to know, where does Moyamoya disease fall in this? Is it caused mostly by genes, or is it caused mostly by environment? And right away, if you think about the patients that get Moyamoya disease, they're mostly young people and really haven't had a lot of environmental hits, or, you know, these are children often that haven't had hypertension, they haven't smoked cigarettes, I hope, and they haven't been, you know, had chronic sort of environmental insults on their arteries. So right away, when you look at the children and the people that are affected with Moyamoya disease, you start thinking, there may be a genetic cause to this, okay? And it's not so much the environment, that there's something in the DNA that person has that increases their risk for Moyamoya disease. And that's one of the reasons I became interested in it. A child should not have a stroke at 10 years of age. You know, it's not like somebody who's 70 and has a stroke and has been smoking or had high blood pressure and other things during their lifetime. A child doesn't have all those risk factors, and so that's one of the reasons I became very interested in it, because I think for people that have Moyamoya disease, chances are they've inherited some sort of, or have some sort of alteration in their DNA that increases their risk for having Moyamoya disease. So what am I talking about when I talk about DNA? So all of us are made up of millions of cells, okay? And if you, and those cells do the work in our body. You have liver cells that help metabolize drugs. You have gut cells that help metabolize the food you eat. You have brain cells that make your body work and think and so on. And so, and the way those cells work are everything that they do is encoded in our DNA. And if you go into one of those cells, you can go into the nucleus, and that's sort of the control center for the cell. If you open up the nucleus, that's where you find the DNA. And the DNA is packaged into structures called chromosomes. People have 46 chromosomes. There's pairs 1 through 22 that are exactly identical between, you've got 2 copies of chromosome 1 through 22, and then we have our sex chromosomes. And men have an XY and women have 2 X chromosomes. So these chromosomes dictate whether we're male or female, and they also tell a lot, they have a lot of information for how cells work. But then these 1 through 22 also have a lot of different segments of the chromosomes that tell the cell how to work. Okay, so go back. So in our chromosomes, for each pair, we get 1 set of a pair from mom and 1 set of a pair from dad. Okay, so 1 through 22 we get from mom or dad, and then the sex chromosome we have to get the X from mom, and then dad has an XY, so he gives either the X or the Y to the child, and that determines whether the baby's male or female. So genetically speaking, you're completely composed of your parents' DNA, half from dad and half from mom, okay? So no matter how hard you try, you can't be that different from your parents. I may have saved some of you many years of psychotherapy. I gave a talk to my daughter's middle school class, and I mentioned this, and I thought the kids were going to have a fit, because at that age they just don't want to hear that they can't get away from being the same as their dad. And so if you take one of these chromosomes, next slide, and actually look at it at the molecular level, what these chromosomes are just long pieces of DNA. And that DNA has the blueprint for telling the cell how to make the body function. So if you stretch out all the DNA on all the chromosomes in one single cell, it would go from here to Washington, D.C. So that's how much DNA you have packaged inside every single cell of your body. And so certain regions of the DNA encode for genes, and the genes are what are the blueprint to tell the cell how to make the proteins, and then the proteins do the work in the body. So those are the enzymes that digest the food you eat. They tell the cell how to make collagens, which provides strength to the tissues, and it tells the body how to make those smooth muscle cells work also. And these genes also control how fast cells grow or proliferate. And so we think that there, in patients with Moyamoya disease, that there's actually alterations in one or more genes in the DNA that cause the smooth muscle cells to grow too fast, leading to the occlusion of the arteries. So that's the hypothesis that we're working on right now. Okay, so the genes, our DNA, is actually just 4 letters. So everything that you are and grow up to be and how your body functions is dictated by just 4 base pairs or nucleotides they're called, but they're basically just 4 letters. Okay. So, and I want to mention that these alterations that occur in genes that predispose us to diseases are just by chance. They're not due to anything that we do, like if we smoke or we, are exposed to things. That doesn't really change the genes. And so I think that's important to mention, that we don't have control over those changes in our genes. They just occur by chances of nature. So if somebody has, and so if I'm talking about these genes being altered in patients with Moyamoya disease, I think you need to understand that these alterations don't occur because of something you did during pregnancy or something else. It's just a chance of nature. Just like it's a chance of nature whether you're male or female. It's just one of those events that occur. Okay, next slide. So when we talk about genetic diseases, there's 3 different types of genetic diseases. One is where there's big changes in the chromosomes, and Down syndrome is an example of that type of genetic disease. And people with Down syndrome, instead of having 46 chromosomes, they have 47, and they have an extra copy of chromosome 21. So, and we know